I'm asking questions on behalf of Southall Black Sisters and
Yes.
Solace Women's Aid, who you will know are part of the violence against women and girls sector and concerned with domestic abuse. So I have three topics, as my lady has kindly said. The first is about equality impact assessments. You say at paragraph 210 that those were carried out by the civil service, but you thought they were a fairly blunt tool. You're not a huge fan.
Yeah, that's probably a reasonable. I think it's an important objective, of course, to see the disproportionate impact on members of our society or specific communities of measures we're taking, or indeed the pandemic as a whole. Whether the EIAs discharge that effectively, I think, is a moot point. So
a useful tool, but maybe not carried out effectively.
Well, whether it's a
useful function, I should have said.
I think a useful aim. Whether the EIA is the right tool as currently focused, I don't know.
And just to take one example, and you may say, well, you have no recollection of this, but in your witness statement, you're talking about one meeting that you chaired, which was a deep dive on the 29th of April. It's paragraph 188, and it's looking forward to the end of lockdown and possible measures to be introduced at the border to reduce risk of imported cases coming in. And 4 recommendations emerge, and the 4th one is a requirement for arrivals to self-isolate for 14 days, either at home or in hotels. Can you remember whether that deep dive was accompanied by an equality impact assessment, and whether there was any consideration of the possibility of domestic abuse emerging if couples are self-isolating for 14 days?
I can't, in relation to that particular deep dive. We were certainly, I certainly remember and reflected on the fact that the lockdowns had a varying effect on, if I can put it this way, family harmony. You had quite a few people, if I could say this, typically middle-class families, and I heard a lot of this in my own constituency, for whom lockdown was an epiphany moment because they spent more time as a family. Now, there are all sorts of challenges and hardships, of course, but there was something rather positive about that. I think there were also, and we were very conscious, be other communities and households and other parts of the country where the experience was that actually the combustible nature of what was going on in the home, whether it's because of mental health challenges or whether it was because of domestic tensions and domestic abuse, where that was very different. Quite whether an EIA would have picked that up and what would it have told us that we could have done about it, I think is another question. But I don't remember, forgive me, on that specific deep dive of the 29th of April, quite what the EIA said, or indeed if it was conducted.
Thank you. And of course, I'm sure you didn't mean to imply this, but domestic abuse happens in middle-class families as well as non-middle-class families.
Oh, sure. I'm just, look, and in fact, in Surrey, we've got very, very high levels of domestic abuse. So I don't think it follows class or even wealth. My reflection is just that I think intuitively and impressionistically, but I suspect the data backs it up, there are 2 diverse experiences of lockdown, both of which were quite salient. Some families where there was a very positive dynamic, for whatever reason, people took a moment to think, well, actually, I want to spend more time with the family, and maybe I was working too hard. We can see this, by the way.
If you don't mind, I've got very limited time.
Well, you did put it to me that I was somehow.
So it's because of me, Mr. Raab. I'm afraid I've imposed strict time.
I think we have the point that families have different experiences in lockdown.
Very good.
Thank you. Moving on to my next topic, and that's about non-shielding vulnerable groups. And you had quite some involvement in considering what was called non-shielding vulnerable groups. So they're not clinically vulnerable. you chaired a meeting on the 24th of April, 3 days before the Prime Minister returned to work, and that was a COVID MIG on the non-shielded vulnerable groups. I don't need to take, I know I can see you're looking for papers, I don't need to take you to the papers. Simon Case presented on non-shielding vulnerable groups, and one of those groups was those experiencing domestic abuse, and he said that was amongst the highest risk of government failing to meet needs, and described that risk as acute. So the MIG took that very seriously. We know that MIGs were abolished and replaced with COVID-O and COVID-S. Are you able to say whether or not that work stream, headed up by Simon Case on domestic abuse, moved over to the COVID-O, COVID-S structure, or whether it was lost or disrupted in some way?
Forgive me, I have no idea. It wasn't either direct personal responsibility, and of course Simon Case was very professional, so I think I would have assumed that would have been continued through.
Right. And my third additional question is this, and again it's about the period when you're acting Prime Minister, and it is the, forgive me, I just have to get this on my screen, it is the 16th of April, and you are addressing the nation in very sombre terms, and your address to the nation is about the decision that had been made, I think, earlier that day, that the lockdown would continue for another 3 weeks. In other words, it wouldn't end early. And you make it very clear what a significant decision that was. You end your speech with, "Please stay at home, save lives and protect the NHS," the government slogan. Some 5 days earlier, the 11th of April, the Home Office had launched its You Are Not Alone campaign. Dame Priti Patel had done the daily press briefing, and she'd made a point of encouraging domestic abuse victims to know that they could leave home under the regulations if they needed to escape in risk of injury, risk of harm. Your speech doesn't contain that information, that those who are suffering domestic abuse or think they're going to suffer domestic abuse or any other sort of injury could leave home. Do you think that it should have included that message?
Was this at the press conference?
It was I think the address to the nation, the daily press conference. Yes. But it was one of the very significant ones, because you're saying lockdown will continue for 3 weeks.
Look, inevitably, you have a very limited period of time, because actually those press conferences were also supposed to be about taking questions, not just talking to the public. So inevitably, we couldn't contain every caveat to the headline advice. It just wasn't manageable. I thought the Home Secretary had really spelt it out very clearly. We felt we'd landed that message. Of course, you would always want to reinforce it, but there was probably a whole range of things where if I'd have gone down and itemised every element of the advice, we would have been there for a disproportionate period of time, and that wouldn't have served the purpose of the press conference and landing the messages, because I think people would have drifted off, frankly, and that was our experience if those became too unwieldy. So it wasn't, I think we did land that message, and I think we continued it in our comms more generally, and it's certainly because it wasn't in every press conference, or indeed that particular one, didn't, I don't think it's fair to read into that a deprioritisation or it being of lower level of importance.
In hindsight, do you think that might have been an immensely welcome message for someone sitting at home watching you, who was experiencing domestic abuse or thought that she might soon, and was hearing that there would be another 3 weeks of lockdown?
Look, I think with all of those groups that suffered disproportionately, you can always look back and think, well, I wish I'd have said a bit more. But in the end, we only had a limited space within which to craft our message and deliver it. And that was true at a whole range of points. You inevitably have to editorialise your message. But certainly we were very mindful throughout that there was this, if you like, simmering issue of domestic abuse, and that lockdown was clearly making it worse. And we wanted to try and make sure that the lines of communication practically were there for anyone that needed that critical help.
Thank you very much. My lady, thank you very much.